That evening, with the city already shrouded in a thick blanket of autumn fog, and the streets of New York pulsating to the rhythm of neon signs and distant sirens, Detective Brian McKinley, exhausted after a 12-hour shift investigating a tangled case of corruption at the port, finally allowed himself to relax in an old-fashioned bar on the corner of Broadway and 42nd Street, where the air was filled with the aroma of whiskey, cigarette smoke, and forgotten stories that people tell strangers to relieve the burden of everyday worries. Brian, a man in his mid-40s, with tired eyes that reflected years of chasing the shadows of the criminal underworld and a touch of gray in his hair that made him look like a hero from an old detective movie, sat down at the bar, ordered a double bourbon without ice, and simply stared into his glass, thinking about how his life, once full of adrenaline and ideals, had turned into a routine of endless interrogations, fake smiles, and lonely evenings at home, where his wife, Emma, was often busy with her business, as she liked to say, leaving him alone with a cold dinner and the television murmuring the news of yet another murder in Lower Manhattan. The bar was a place where time seemed to slow down and people sitting shoulder to shoulder could suddenly start talking about anything from politics to personal dramas, and Brian, who was usually not inclined to chat with strangers, this time felt like he needed to talk, or at least listen to someone's story, to distract himself from thinking about how his partner had almost put them in the line of fire during a raid today, and how the chief had once again scolded him for being too impulsive, although it was this very impulsiveness that had saved more than one life in the past. Next to him, on a high stool, sat a guy in his 30s with tousled hair and a worn leather jacket who introduced himself as Tom, a mechanic from Brooklyn, and they began the conversation with a banal exchange of remarks about the weather. But gradually, under the influence of alcohol and that strange atmosphere that reigns in bars after midnight, the conversation turned to more personal topics, and Tom, with the enthusiasm of a man who has long had no listener, began to share his adventures, and Brian, nodding and sipping whiskey, listened, unaware that these words were about to turn his world upside down. "You know, bro, this bar is a real hangout," Tom began, waving his arms like he was conducting an invisible orchestra, his voice hoarse from cigarettes, but full of that lively energy that makes people believe every word. "I come here a couple of times a week after my shift at the garage, where I spend all day tinkering with engines, and there's always something interesting going on. Like last week, I was sitting here like this, and this woman came up to me. Oh man, she was something. Tall, with long brown hair that fell over her shoulders like a waterfall, and eyes as green as emeralds that you could drown in. She was wearing a black dress, tight, with a cutout that made you forget about all your problems, and she smelled like some expensive perfume, sweet, with notes of vanilla, and something exotic that immediately made your head spin. Brian smiled at the corner of his mouth as he took a sip, and thought that Tom was obviously exaggerating, like all the guys in bars when it came to women, but there was something familiar in the description, something that pricked his chest like a needle, but he pushed the thought away, deciding that it was just fatigue playing tricks, and asked, trying to sound casual, "And what? She just got hooked. Tell me more, Tom. I have nothing better to do today than listen to stories." Tom laughed, slapping the bar and the bartender, an old Irishman named Patrick with a gray beard and tattoos on his arms, winked at them as he poured more drinks, and the noise of the bar, the laughter of a couple at a corner table, the clink of glasses, the music from an old jukebox playing Eric Clapton blues created the perfect backdrop for this kind of conversation, where fact and fiction mixed. But this time, as Brian would soon discover, it was all too true. "Oh yeah, she did, and for good reason," Tom continued, his eyes bright with memory, and he leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "She said, 'Hey, handsome, want to buy the lady a drink?' And of course I didn't refuse. I ordered her a martini, and we started talking. Her name is Emma, Emma Harris. By the way, she works in some office downtown, marketing or something. But man, she wasn't just chatting, she was flirting. She looked me in the eyes, touched my arm when she laughed at my jokes, and told me things about herself. About how she loves adventure, how tired she is of the routine, and how sometimes she just comes here to feel alive. And then, after the second cocktail, she leaned over and whispered, "You seem like a guy who knows how to entertain a woman. Maybe you can show me?" I almost choked, brother, because she was not just attractive, she was like a fire that ignited everything around her. Brian felt his heart skip a beat because the name Emma Harris was his wife's name, and the description matched perfectly. The brown hair, the green eyes, the black dress she wore to meet her girlfriends, and even the perfume he'd given her for their anniversary, which had a hint of vanilla, but he didn't show it. He just gripped his glass tighter, trying to stay calm because in his line of work, he knew he couldn't show emotion even when he was seething inside, and instead he asked, his voice even but doubt creeping in like a shadow in a dark alley. "That sounds good. So what happened next? She comes here a lot, you say?" Tom nodded, not noticing the change in his companion's expression, and continued, waving his arms even more vigorously, his story unfolding like a gripping novel, full of details that Brian soaked up like a sponge, analyzing each word like evidence at a crime scene. "Oh, yeah, she said she comes here a couple of times a week, usually in the evenings when her husband is at work. He's a cop or something. He's always busy, and she feels lonely. And then, well, we danced to the music that was playing, and she was pressed close. Her body was hot, and she was whispering all sorts of compliments like, 'Your arms are so strong, Tom. They give me goosebumps.' I thought it was my lucky night. But then she suddenly looked at her watch and said, 'Sorry, honey, I have to go, but I'll see you later.' And she left, leaving me with her number on a napkin. But here's the weird thing, the next day I saw her here again, but not alone. She came with some guy, tall, in a suit, with a goatee. They sat in the corner, giggling, and he kissed her on the neck, and she didn't resist. On the contrary, she responded. I didn't go up to her, of course. I didn't want to get involved, but I thought, wow, this Emma is a real adventurer. She often shows up with different guys, as I heard from the bartender, but she always looks like she's looking for something more than just a drink." Brian sat still, his mind racing, connecting the dots. Emma, his Emma, who had been out on business a lot in recent months, coming home late, smelling of alcohol and other people's perfume, always smiling and telling stories of boring meetings. But now those stories had new meaning, and the doubts he'd always pushed aside as paranoia from his job, where everyone lied, were creeping into his head like snakes, coiling around his thoughts, making him sift through memories, the way she'd evaded questions, the way her phone was always on silent, the rarity of their sex life. But he didn't say anything, just nodded at Tom, forcing a smile and saying, "That's an interesting story, Tom. Life is full of surprises, isn't it? Tell me more if you have any." Tom, inspired, kept talking, his words flowing, full of enthusiasm and detail that felt like a knife to Brian. But he listened because in his line of work, information is a weapon, and he wanted to gather it all before he acted. "Oh, there's more. She was here last week with the same guy with the beard, and they ordered champagne, and they were sitting close, and I heard her say to him, 'Honey, you make me feel free, unlike at home where everything is so predictable.' And he said, 'Emma, you deserve better than that cop who doesn't even notice how amazing you are.' I wasn't eavesdropping. I was just sitting nearby. But man, she was laughing and kissing him, and then they walked away together, holding hands. And yesterday she came in alone and sat at the counter, and we talked again. She said, 'Tom, you're cute, but I'm looking for something special.' And again she flirted, touched me with her knee, looked at me in a way that gave me goosebumps. But I realized that she was playing, enjoying the attention, and often mentioned that her husband didn't suspect anything because he was too busy with work. You know, brother, such women are like a hurricane, beautiful but dangerous." Brian felt his insides tighten, doubts not just creeping in now, but raging like a storm, making him remember their wedding 10 years ago, when Emma had looked at him with love, promising eternal fidelity, and how that love had gradually faded under the pressure of his career, the endless shifts and secrets he couldn't share, but he still loved her, or thought he did, and now this story of Tom made him doubt everything: her smiles, her "I love you" in the morning, their life together, which seemed stable but was probably a facade. "Sounds like a real romance," Brian said, trying to keep his voice from shaking, raising his glass. To the women who keep us on our toes. And that bearded guy, who do you think he is? Just a friend? Tom shrugged, finishing his beer, and replied with a smirk. I don't know, bro, but he looks like a banker or a lawyer, drives an expensive car. I saw them get into a black Mercedes. She called him Alex, and they acted like they were in love, whispering, laughing. And she told me, Alex understands me better than anyone. But enough about her, tell me about yourself. You said you were a cop? You must have a lot of stories. Brian nodded, but his mind was far away. He imagined Emma in this bar, with Alex, with Tom, with the others, and doubts grew like a snowball, making his heart beat faster, but he didn't show anything. He only started talking about his latest case to distract himself, although inside he was already planning how he would check all this after all. He is an investigator, and the truth always comes to light, even if it is painful. The conversation went on for another hour, Tom sharing other stories, but Brian's thoughts kept returning to Emma, analyzing every detail. How she had seduced Tom, describing her touches, her whispers, her glances, and how she often appeared with Alex, kissing in the corner, and the doubts were no longer just doubts, they were seeds of jealousy and pain that were growing in his soul, forcing him to look at his wedding ring with a new, bitter feeling. When Tom finally left, saying goodbye and good luck, Brian remained seated, ordering another whiskey, and staring into the mirror behind the bar, where his tired face was reflected, full of unanswered questions. Another one, Patrick? He asked the bartender, who nodded as he poured, and Brian thought, what if this is all true? What if Emma really is looking for adventure on the side? And in that moment, in the noise of the bar, where life went on as usual, he realized that his own life had just changed forever, and doubt, those insidious companions, would now be with him until he got to the bottom of the truth. But for now he was silent, finishing his whiskey, planning his next move, maybe follow her, or talk to her directly, but not today, not now, when emotions were running high. The bar was noisy, people were laughing, and Brian sat in the center of it, alone with his thoughts, and the night seemed endless. When Brian McKinley walked through the door of his fifth-floor apartment in an old brick building on the Upper West Side, the city outside was already drowning in the cold light of the streetlights, and the air in the hallway greeted him with a familiar, but now alien scent, a mix of lavender, which Emma liked to add to her diffuser, and something else, barely perceptible, slightly sweet, with notes of sandalwood and musk, as if someone other than he had left their mark here. The sound of his keys jingling in the metal bowl on the console, usually so familiar, today cut through his nerves like the creak of a door in an abandoned house. He took off his coat and hung it on a hook, but his eyes, trained by years of work as a detective, were already sliding over small details. A pair of Emma's shoes, carelessly thrown by the door, lightly stained with city grime, as if she had been in a hurry. A half-finished glass of wine on the kitchen counter, even though she usually kept everything sparkling clean, and a phone lying face down on the couch, as if someone wanted it left alone. Brian froze, feeling the same doubts that had been brewing in the bar under Tom's hoarse voice and the clink of glasses come alive inside him again, doubts that now, in the silence of their home, were becoming something tangible, like a shadow following him. Emma was home. He could hear the sound of running water coming from the bathroom, and he heard her humming something light, a tune he didn't recognize, maybe one of the pop hits they played in the bars where, according to Tom, she went so often. Brian went into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, but his movements were mechanical, and his mind was already working as if at a crime scene, noticing, analyzing, looking for inconsistencies. He noticed that her handbag, lying on a chair, was slightly open, and the edge of a red box was sticking out a package of a new perfume that he had not seen before. When did she manage to buy it? He thought, but did not touch it, only memorizing the name. Old Rose, with gold lettering, clearly not cheap. His fingers froze on the bottle, and Tom's words floated into his head. She smelled of some expensive perfume, sweet, with notes of vanilla and something exotic. Sandalwood, musk, rose, it all matched, and this coincidence pricked him like a needle. Brian, are you home? Emma's voice, soft and slightly hoarse, pulled him out of his thoughts. She came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a white towel, her hair damp and spread over her shoulders, and smiled at him with that same smile that had once made his heart skip a beat, but now it seemed to him like a mask behind which something unknown was hiding. "You're late today. Staying at the station again?" "At the bar," he answered, looking into her eyes, trying to catch the slightest shadow of anxiety, but her green eyes, the same ones Tom described as emeralds, looked evenly, serenely. "The shift was tough, so I decided to relax. Where were you?" Emma shrugged as she walked past him to the refrigerator, the movement leaving the same sweet aroma he'd noticed in the hallway. She opened the door and pulled out a yogurt, and Brian saw her fingers tremble slightly as she pulled a spoon out of the drawer. "Oh, at a friend's," she said without turning around, and her voice was too light, as if she'd been rehearsing the phrase. "Sarah's, you know her. We drank wine, talked about work. Nothing special." "Sarah," Brian repeated, his tone neutral, but inside he was already mentally going over the facts. Sarah, her colleague at the marketing agency, lived in Brooklyn, and the drive there and back would take longer than it had taken him to leave for work that morning. "How long were you there?" Emma turned around, holding the yogurt, her eyebrows raised slightly as if the question had surprised her, but she quickly smiled, waving it off. "Not really, a couple of hours. Then I went into the store and bought a few things. Are you interrogating me, investigator?" She laughed, and that laugh, so familiar, had once been music to his ears, but now sounded like an alarm. Brian smiled back, but his eyes, trained to spot lies, were already registering the details. She hadn't met his eyes for more than a second. Her fingers were fidgeting with the spoon, and the phone she'd snatched from the couch on her way back to the bathroom was clutched to her chest like something to be hidden. "Just wondering," he said, taking a sip of water and his gaze sliding to her phone. "Do you always take it to the bathroom with you now?" Emma paused in the doorway, turned around, and for a moment her smile wavered, but she quickly regained control with a shrug. "Habit. Social media is addictive, you know. I'm going to answer a few messages while I dry my hair." "I see," Brian nodded, his voice even, but inside he was already making hypotheses, as if he were under interrogation. Why was her phone always on silent? Why did she take it to the bathroom, which she had never done before? And why were her stories about nights out with her friends always so vague, lacking the details that he, as an investigator, was accustomed to demanding from witnesses? She went into the bathroom, closing the door, and the hum of the hairdryer drowned out her singing. Brian sat down on the sofa, his fingers absent-mindedly fiddling with his wedding ring, his gaze falling on his glass of wine. He leaned closer. There was a smudge of lipstick on the rim of the glass, a bright red that Emma rarely wore, preferring nude shades. He remembered Tom describing her at the bar, wearing a black dress with a neckline that made you forget all your problems. Brian stood up, went to the closet in the bedroom, and opened the door. The black dress was hanging on a hanger, but the hem was slightly wrinkled, and there was a tiny stain on the fabric that looked like wine. His heart sank, but he closed the closet without making a sound. Back in the living room, he sat staring at the television as the news played, but he didn't hear a word. His mind, accustomed to sorting out facts, was already on the lookout. Every little thing, the perfume, the glass, the phone, the dress, was evidence, and although he hadn't yet made any accusations, his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. He remembered Tom's words about bearded Alex, and Emma saying she felt free with him, and they burned like acid. But he was a professional, and professionals didn't act on emotion. He decided he'd start gathering information, checking her schedule, maybe talking to Sarah, maybe even following her to that bar. But for now, he remained silent, like a predator waiting to pounce. Emma came out of the bathroom, already in her pajamas, with a smile that now seemed too rehearsed. "Go to bed, Brian. You look exhausted," she said, leaning down to kiss his cheek. Her lips were warm, but he felt cold. "Soon," he replied, watching her go into the bedroom, taking the phone with her. The door closed, and the house that had once been their refuge now seemed alien, full of shadows and secrets that he, as an investigator, was obliged to uncover. Morning came to the McKinley apartment with gray light filtering through the curtains and the sound of the coffee machine as Emma turned it on, humming a tune that again seemed unfamiliar to Brian. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, where a crack in the plaster reminded him of the cracks that were beginning to appear in his life. The night had been restless, with him tossing and turning, waking up from fragments of dreams in which Emma was laughing in the arms of some shadowy figure, and he, like a spectator in a theater, could only watch. Now, with the first rays of the sun, the doubts that had seemed poisonous but vague the previous day began to take shape, and Brian, accustomed to trusting his instincts, decided that it was time to act. He didn't want to believe the worst. He didn't want what Tom, a random guy from a bar, had said to be true, but his professional nature, hardened by years of digging for truth in the maze of lies, wouldn't let him just brush it off. He stood up, pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, and while Emma made coffee, he began collecting the first clues, as if this wasn't his own heart, but another case. Emma left for work earlier than usual, throwing over her shoulder, "I'll be late today. We have an urgent project. Don't expect me for dinner." Her voice was cheerful, but Brian detected a subtle urgency in it, as if she was anxious to leave. He nodded, muttering something about his day at the station, but once the door slammed behind her, his movements became precise, almost automatic. He started with what was at hand, her purse, left on the kitchen table as if deliberately to check it. Brian hesitated for only a second, a twinge of guilt at invading her privacy, but he brushed it aside as if it were an annoying fly. Inside, among her makeup and keys, he found a receipt from a restaurant Belle Epoque, a French bistro on 57th Street, dated last Thursday. The total was $128, dinner for two, including a bottle of Chardonnay and oysters. Brian frowned. He'd been on duty that night, and Emma had said she'd been home, watching a show and going to bed early. He folded the check carefully and slipped it into his pocket, feeling something hot boiling inside him, but he forced himself to breathe evenly. It could have been anything: dinner with a coworker, a friend, a client. But why hadn't she mentioned it? He walked into the bedroom, where her old phone sat on the nightstand, a backup she used when her main one died. Emma had always been careless with technology, and Brian knew she rarely cleared her call or text history. He turned on the device, and the screen came to life without a passcode, another habit of hers that had always irritated him, but now came in handy. In the call log, he found several numbers marked Alex M. Calls made late at night, some lasting only a minute, others over half an hour. The last one had been 3 days ago, at 11:47 p.m., when Brian was on the night shift. His fingers hovered over the screen, his heart pounding. He opened the messages, but they were empty. She must have deleted the messages, or the phone was only used for calls. Brian wrote the number down in his notebook, feeling his professional instincts overpower his emotions. He didn't know who Alex was, but the name was already burning in his mind like a brand. "It doesn't mean anything," he muttered to himself, standing in the middle of the bedroom, but his voice was unconvincing. He wanted to believe that this was a mistake, that Emma was simply dating a colleague, that Alex was someone from her work, maybe a new client, or even a relative she'd forgotten to mention. But his deductive mind was already putting the pieces together, and the picture that emerged was not comforting. Brian decided to dig deeper. He pulled out his laptop and logged into their shared bank account. Emma never changed the passwords, either because she trusted him or maybe because she just didn't think he'd check. The statements for the last 2 months showed several transactions he couldn't explain. A payment in Belle Epoque wasn't the only one. There were bills from the cocktail bar Moonlight Lounge for amounts ranging from $50 to $80 3 times in the last 3 weeks, always in the evenings when he was at work. Another transaction, $245, at a women's boutique on Madison Avenue that, according to its website, sold dresses Emma had said would never buy because they were too expensive. But the black dress he'd seen in the closet yesterday seemed suspiciously like a model from the store. Brian wrote down the dates and amounts, his hand moving methodically, as if taking notes, but inside he felt something crumbling: not the house, not the marriage, but his belief that he knew the woman he'd been with for 10 years. He decided to check her schedule. Emma kept a calendar app synced to their shared cloud, and Brian, knowing her password and what now seemed like a bitter irony, their wedding date, opened it. The nights she'd supposedly been with Sarah or in a work meeting were labeled personal or had no description at all. One of those nights, last Friday, was listed as meeting at 8 p.m., with no location or name. Brian remembered her coming home after midnight that night, smelling faintly of gin and wearing that same smile that now seemed alien to him. He closed his laptop, feeling his throat tighten, but forced himself to get up and continue. The next step was risky but necessary. He called Sarah, Emma's colleague, under the pretext of arranging a surprise for his wife. Sarah, a cheerful woman with a loud laugh, answered immediately. "Brian, hi. A surprise for Emma? Oh, that's so sweet. What are you planning?" "I just want to do something special," he began, trying to sound casual. "She mentioned that you often see her in the evenings, so I thought maybe you could tell me what she likes. When was the last time you saw each other?" Sarah hesitated, and the pause, just a few seconds, was like a siren for Brian. "Well, we haven't hung out in a while, probably a couple of months," she said, and there was a slight hesitation in her voice. "She's always busy with some projects, you know. We're in a rush at the agency right now, but I can ask when she's free." "No need," Brian said quickly, feeling his stomach clench. "I'll handle it myself. Thanks, Sarah." He hung up, and the silence in the apartment was deafening. Sarah hadn't seen Emma in a couple of months, and Emma said she'd been to see her last week. A lie. The first obvious lie he'd ever caught, and it hit him like a bullet. But he still clung to the hope that it was a misunderstanding, that there was an explanation he just couldn't see yet. Maybe she was seeing another friend. Maybe Sarah had simply forgotten. Brian decided to take it a step further. He knew Emma sometimes left her main phone at home when she took her backup, and today she had left it on the charger in the bedroom when she left. He picked up the device, entered the password, the same one he used for his calendar, and opened the messaging app. His correspondence with Sarah had been sparse, mostly work-related, nothing personal. But his contacts still included the same Alexa, and although the messages had been deleted, he found one in his recently deleted folder, automatically restored. "Meet me at Moonlight 9, 0 p.m., wear something sexy." Sent 3 days ago. Brian felt his blood run cold, but he forced himself to finish reading. There was no reply from Emma. She had deleted it, but the message itself, short and direct, was like a knife in the heart. He put the phone down, trying not to let his emotions get the better of him. His mind was screaming, "This is evidence, but not proof. Don't jump to conclusions." He decided the next step was surveillance. He knew the address, Moonlight Lounge, the same bar where, judging by the bills, Emma frequented more often than she said. Tonight he was going there, not as a husband, but as an investigator, quietly, with a cool head, to see for himself what was going on. But even as he planned it, he felt a thread of hope still holding him. He wanted it to be a mistake, for Emma to be just an overworked wife looking for a break, not a woman leading a double life. The evening came quickly. Brian put on a dark jacket, pulled on a cap, and went to Moonlight Lounge, which was a few blocks from their house. The bar was trendy, with dim lighting, leather couches, and jazz music pouring from the speakers. He took a seat in the corner, ordered a beer so as not to stand out, and began to watch. Emma was gone, but he was in no hurry to leave. The bartender, a young guy with a tattoo on his neck, seemed familiar with half the customers, and Brian, deciding to take a chance, approached the counter when the place had emptied a little. "Hi," he began, holding a bottle of beer. "I'm looking for a woman, maybe you know her. Tall, brown hair, green eyes, name is Emma. Does she come here often?" The bartender squinted, then nodded. "Oh, Emma? Yeah, she comes here, usually on Thursdays or Fridays. Often with some guy, tall, in suits, with a beard. A nice couple, always cheerful. Are you her friend?" "Something like that," Brian answered evasively, feeling his hope melt like ice in his glass. "When was the last time?" "Yesterday, I think," the bartender replied, wiping down the counter. With the same guy. They left around 11, laughing, hugging. Want me to tell her something? No, don't, Brian said, and his voice was calm, but inside he felt the last wall crumbling. He went back to his table, finished his beer, and went outside, where the cold air hit his face. He stood under a street lamp, looking at the people passing by, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel not just anger but pain. But he still wasn't ready to accuse. He needed proof, irrefutable, like a murder case, and he knew he would find it, even if the truth broke his heart. The morning at the 19th Street police station smelled of roasted coffee, printer paper, and the faint tinge of sweat that always hung in the interrogation room where Brian McKinley had spent the last 3 hours listening to the rambling testimony of a small-time drug dealer caught with a load of meth in the Bronx. His head was pounding from lack of sleep, and despite the need to focus on the case, his thoughts kept wandering back to the night before Moonlight Lounge, to the bartender's words, to the image of Emma laughing in the arms of some bearded man, whose name Alex was now a persistent melody in his head that he couldn't shake. He sat at his desk, littered with folders and empty coffee cups, and tried to focus on the report, but his fingers fiddled with his pen instead of typing, and his eyes wandered around the room, catching on familiar details. The peeling paint on the wall, the board with the suspect's photos, the hum of the air conditioner that never seemed to cope with the summer heat. The station was his second home, a place where he felt at home, but today, even here, in the midst of the familiar chaos, he felt like an outsider, as if his personal life, like a poisonous gas, had seeped into these walls and poisoned everything around him. His partner, Danny Corso, a man in his 50s with a thick mustache and a habit of chewing on a toothpick, plopped down in the chair opposite him, throwing a stack of papers on the table. Danny was the kind of cop who had seen it all, from bloody showdowns in Harlem to political scandals in City Hall, and his calm, bordering on cynicism, always acted on Brian like an anchor in a storm. But today, Danny, noticing the shadow on his partner's face, narrowed his eyes and, instead of talking about the case, asked directly, with that gruff directness that was his calling card. "What's wrong with you, Mac? You look like you've been run over by a truck. Has the boss been messing with your head again?" Brian leaned back in his chair, dropping his pen on the table and rubbing his temples. He didn't want to share, didn't want to turn his doubts into words that would make them real, but Danny wasn't one to be brushed aside. They'd worked together for 7 years, through shootouts, informants betraying them, and night shifts where the only salvation was black coffee and conversations about life. Brian sighed, looking at his partner, and decided it was better to talk it out than to keep it inside, where it ate away at him like acid. "Not the boss," he began, lowering his voice so that none of his colleagues scurrying around the room would hear. "There's something wrong at home with Emma." Danny raised his eyebrows, took the toothpick out of his mouth, and leaned closer, his gaze growing serious. "Emma? Your Emma? What happened? She's supposed to be the perfect wife, always smiling, always with dinner on the table." Brian smiled wryly, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, that's what I thought too. But lately, she's changed. She comes home late, has some shady stories, sometimes with her friends, sometimes she's late at work. And yesterday I found out that she often goes to the same bar with some guy. Alex, bearded, in suits. The bartender said they hug there, laugh like lovers." Danny whistled, leaning back, his face taking on an expression Brian knew all too well, a mixture of sympathy and weariness, as if he'd heard this story 1,000 times. "Look, brother," he began, lowering his voice to keep the conversation between them. "I get that you're a cop, and you think of everything in your head as a case, evidence, motive, suspects. But this is your wife, not a murder case. Stay out of it, Mac. Personal life is not our jurisdiction. You start digging, and you're going to find something you'll regret." Brian felt a surge of protest inside him. He respected Danny, valued his experience, but his partner's words sounded like a betrayal, like he was asking him to turn a blind eye to the truth. "Stay out of it?" he asked, his voice sharper than he'd expected. "Danny, I found a receipt from a restaurant we weren't at. I saw her phone calls to someone named Alex at midnight. She lies to me about being with a friend, and her friend says she hasn't seen her in months. And you're telling me not to get involved?" Danny held up his hands in surrender, but his eyes remained serious. "I'm telling you, you're walking on thin ice, Mac. You start following your wife, checking her phone, her bills, and then what? Plant a bug in her car? Follow her with binoculars? You're a cop, not a cheap movie private eye. If she's hiding something, you'll sense it, but digging into her life like it's a case is the road to hell. I've seen people break like that. Remember Tony from the 12th precinct? Caught his wife with a lover, started an investigation like you did, and ended up getting divorced, depressed, and now he's retired, drowning his sorrows in a bar. Don't make the same mistakes he did." Brian gritted his teeth as he looked at Danny and felt his fingers curl into fists beneath the table. He knew his partner was right at least about emotions clouding judgment, but he couldn't stop. This wasn't just curiosity or jealousy. It was a need to know, a need that burned inside him like a fire, fueled by every new fact, every little detail he found. He couldn't just sit there and wait for the truth to emerge, because the truth, he knew from his work, rarely came without effort. "I'm not Tony," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not going to ruin our lives, Danny. I just want to understand what's going on. If this is a mistake, if she's just, I don't know, in a crisis, I want to know. And if it's true, if she's—" He trailed off, unable to say the word betrayal. "Then I need to know, too. I can't live in ignorance." Danny shook his head, putting the toothpick back in his mouth. "You're stubborn, Mac. Always have been. But listen to the old man. Even if you find something, what are you going to do? Go to her with a folder of evidence like you're going to interrogate her. Emma Harris, you stand accused of adultery. Think about how that would look. You love her, don't you?" Brian nodded, but it was almost a mechanical nod. Did he love her? He loved the woman he had known 10 years ago, who had laughed at his jokes, who had waited for him after work with a hot dinner, who had whispered to him at night that he was her hero. But the woman who now came home smelling of someone else's perfume, who hid her phone and lied about her evenings, that was the woman he was no longer sure he knew, and therefore no longer sure he loved. "I love you," he said, but his voice wavered, and Danny noticed. "Then give her a chance to explain," his partner said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Don't dig until you talk. Maybe things aren't as they seem. Now go ahead and finish your report. The boss is already looking sideways. And keep a cool head, Mac. You're the best investigator I know, but you're out of your league on this one." Brian nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. He opened the report, began typing, but Danny's words echoed in his head. "Don't pry." It was easy to say, but how could he pry when every day brought new questions? When a restaurant checked a midnight call, the bartender's words formed a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. He knew Danny was right. Personal life was not the business of a police investigation, but his skills, his instincts, his habit of getting to the bottom of things were now working against him, pushing him forward into the darkness where the truth could be devastating. After lunch, while Danny went to meet with the informant, Brian stayed behind at the station and decided to take another step. He pulled out his laptop, connected to the police database, and entered the name Alex M. It was risky. Using police resources for personal gain could cost him his career, but he convinced himself it was just a test, nothing serious. He entered additional details. Male, 30-45, New York City, possibly in finance or law, as Tom had hinted. The search returned dozens of hits, but one profile caught his eye. Alexander Martin, 38, attorney, owner of a Wall Street firm, registered owner of a black Mercedes. The photo in the database was fuzzy, but the man in it was tall, with a neat beard and an expensive suit. Brian felt his pulse quicken. It could have been him, or it couldn't have been him. But there were too many matches. He wrote down the address of the firm and decided that he would stop by that evening after his shift. Not to talk, not to confront, just to look, to see this Alex with his own eyes, to make sure that he wasn't imagining things. He knew it was a dangerous path, that Danny had been right to warn him of the consequences, but he couldn't stop. It was like the investigation he'd been conducting all his life. Each new fact led to the next, and he couldn't quit until he got to the end. Late in the day, as the station began to empty and his colleagues went home, Brian sat at his desk, staring at the screen, still on the Alexander Martin profile page. He felt like he was on the line, between a husband who wanted to believe his wife and an investigator who knew the truth was rarely pleasant. He closed his laptop, put on his jacket, and walked outside to the cold wind and sirens of New York City. He headed to his car, knowing that tonight he would take another step in this investigation he couldn't let go of, even if it tore his life apart. New York City at dusk was a living thing, pulsing with neon lights, the hum of cars, and snatches of conversation coming from open cafe windows. Brian McKinley sat in his battered Honda, parked in the shadows across from the glass building of the marketing agency on Park Avenue where Emma worked. His fingers tapped the steering wheel and his gaze was fixed on the front entrance, where employees were pouring out like ants at the end of the workday. He felt out of place, as if his own skin had become too tight. Brian, a detective for 15 years, used to tracking drug dealers and thieves, was now sitting in his car, watching his wife as if she were a suspect in a murder case. The thought burned like a hot coal, but he couldn't stop, not after the restaurant receipts, the midnight calls to Alex, the bartender's fun couple comments, and Danny's warnings that only added fuel to the fire of his determination. He wanted the truth, even if it broke his heart. Brian had started following her 3 days ago, after a conversation with his partner who had advised him to keep it simple. He'd spent the first evening right there, outside the office, watching Emma leave at 6:30 p.m., get into a taxi, and head home. Nothing suspicious, she'd even called him to ask if he was coming to dinner, and her voice had sounded as warm as it had when they were newlyweds. The second evening was similar. She'd stayed until 7, gone out with a colleague, the same Sarah she'd learned she hadn't hanged out with in a while, and they'd gone their separate ways at the metro. Brian had almost believed that his suspicions were the result of fatigue and paranoia, that Emma was simply overloaded with work, and that he, like a fool, was seeing shadows where there weren't any. But on the third evening yesterday, she'd left the office in a black coat he'd never seen before, and instead of taking a taxi, she'd gotten into a black Mercedes parked across the street. Brian didn't have time to see the driver, but his heart sank as if from a blow when he remembered Tom's words about the bearded man in the suit and the Mercedes. He didn't follow her, he didn't want to risk her noticing his car, but that was the moment when his hope, thin as a spider's web, began to break. Today, he was better prepared. In the glove compartment was a compact camera with a telephoto lens, which he sometimes used for work, and on the passenger seat was a notebook where he jotted down times and places and details, as if he were writing a report. He hated himself for this, for turning his life into an investigation, for not being able to simply ask Emma and look her in the eye, but confronting her scared him more than following her. What if she lied, or worse, told the truth? He wasn't prepared for the answer, so he chose to shadow, to watch, to gather facts, as he had done his entire career. The clock read 6:15 when the office doors swung open and Emma emerged, this time in a navy blue dress, her hair down, auburn in the streetlights. She paused at the entrance, looking at her phone, and Brian wasted no time in picking up the camera and snapping a few pictures. The click of the shutter was barely audible, but each sound seemed as loud as a gunshot. She looked happy. A smile, light, almost weightless, played across her lips as she typed on the screen. Brian felt a pang of jealousy, sharp as a blade, but he forced himself to focus. He waited, watching her look around as if searching for someone. 5 minutes later, the same black Mercedes pulled up. Brian tensed, his fingers tightening around the camera as he peered into the car. The driver, a man in a dark suit, got out and opened the passenger door. Tall and trimly bearded, he smiled at Emma, and she laughed and hugged him before getting into the car. Brian clicked the shutter, capturing every moment. Her hand on his shoulder, his palm on her waist, their smiles that seemed so natural, so close. It was him, Alex, Brian was sure. The same Alex whose name burned in his memory, whose calls he saw on Emma's phone, whose existence made his life a living nightmare. The car pulled away, and Brian, without thinking, started the engine and followed them at a safe distance. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady on the wheel. Years of work had taught him to keep his cool even in the most tense moments. The Mercedes headed towards the center, away from Moonlight Lounge, the same bar where the bartender said Emma had been with the bearded man. Brian parked in an alley where he could see the entrance and picked up his camera again. A few minutes later, Emma and the man got out of the car and walked into the bar, holding hands. Brian took a few more pictures, feeling his insides tighten. He wanted to rush in, grab her hand, demand an explanation, but instead he stayed in the car, like a predator, biding his time. An hour passed in agonizing anticipation. He sat looking at the entrance, trying to convince himself that it could be innocent, a business meeting, an old friend, anything but what all the evidence screamed at him. But when Emma and the man came out, their behavior crushed the last vestiges of hope he had. They stopped at the car, and Brian now thought of him as Alex leaned toward her, whispering something in her ear. Emma laughed, throwing her head back, and her hand came to rest on his chest. And then he kissed her, not on the cheek, not in a friendly way, but deeply, passionately, and she responded, pressing herself against him. Brian froze, the camera falling from his hands onto the seat, and he felt the air leave his lungs. This was no mistake, no misunderstanding. This was the truth he had been so afraid to find. He sat there, staring into space, until the Mercedes drove away, taking Emma and Alex to an unknown destination. His mind, accustomed to analyzing, to sorting out facts, was now paralyzed. He had seen it with his own eyes, but he still couldn't believe it. His Emma, the woman he loved, with whom he shared dreams, plans, nights, was now with someone else, and this other person was looking at her the way he once did. Brian slammed his fist on the steering wheel, and the pain in his knuckles brought him back to reality. He didn't cry, he hadn't cried since he was a child, but something inside him snapped, like a branch under the weight of snow. He got home late, when the city had gone quiet and his apartment was cold and silent. Emma wasn't there. She'd texted that she'd be working late, and that message, which had arrived at 9:30 p.m., now seemed like a taunt. Brian sat down on the couch, pulled out his camera, and plugged it into his laptop. The photos loaded one after another. Emma smiling outside the office, Emma hugging Alex, Emma kissing him outside the bar. Each image was a blow, but he forced himself to look through them all as if they were a case and not his life. He saved the files in a folder called Evidence, feeling the word cut into him from the inside. But even now, with the hard facts before his eyes, he didn't know what to do. Confront, divorce, or try to forget, forgive, get her back. He remembered Danny's words, "You'll find something you regret." His partner was right, but Brian didn't regret it, not yet. He wanted the truth, and he got it. Now the question was how to live with it. He poured himself a whiskey, his first sip of the evening, and sat in the dark, looking at the photographs that burned on the screen like evidence at a crime scene. Tomorrow he will decide what to do next. Tomorrow he might talk to her. But today he simply sat, letting the pain and anger war inside him as the night grew thicker outside and his world crumbled, frame by frame. The night in Brian McKinley's apartment was long, as if time had decided to slow down to let him feel every second of the pain that had settled in his chest. He sat in the living room, in the darkness, lit only by the dim light of his laptop screen, where the photos of Emma and Alex, taken hours earlier, Moonlight Lounge, looked at him like silent witnesses to his shattered world. The whiskey in the glass had long since warmed up, but he did not touch it after the first sip. Alcohol could not drown out what was happening inside. His mind, accustomed to putting facts on shelves, now resembled a labyrinth, where each turn led to a new question. Why? For how long? And most importantly, what now? Brian, an investigator with 15 years of experience, accustomed to finding answers in the most confusing cases, now felt helpless, like a newbie faced with his first unsolvable case. He closed his laptop, but the images of Emma laughing in another man's arms remained burned into his mind. He tried to remember when it had all gone wrong, when their marriage, once so warm and loving, had begun to fray. Was it his fault? His endless shifts, the night shifts, the cases he brought home, not in his pocket, but in his head, where they haunted him? Or was it Emma, her weariness at his absence, his inability to be a husband and not a cop who saw suspects in everyone? He didn't know, but he felt that the answers lay somewhere beyond the evidence he had collected. The receipts, the calls, the photographs. The answers were in her heart, which now seemed to belong to someone else. Morning came quietly, gray light filtering through the curtains, and Brian had not slept a wink. He got up and made coffee, but it tasted as bitter as his thoughts. Emma came home in the early morning around 4, and he heard her quietly go into the bedroom, thinking he was asleep. She did not come into the living room, did not kiss his cheek as she had done before, even in their most difficult times. He did not go to her, did not ask questions, not now, not in this state, when anger and pain might spill over into words he would later regret. Instead, he decided to continue his investigation, but this time with a new plan, not just to follow, but to understand who Alex was, what he meant to Emma, and perhaps find a way to get back what he had lost, if that was even possible. Brian went to the station earlier than usual, hoping that work would distract him, but thoughts of Emma and Alex followed him like a shadow. The station was noisy. Phones were ringing, colleagues were discussing a new case of a robbery at a Fifth Avenue jewelry store, and Danny, his partner, was already sitting at his desk, chewing on his ever-present toothpick and reviewing reports. Brian tried to look normal, but Danny, with his animal instinct for changes in people, immediately noticed that something was wrong. "Mac, you look like a ghost," he said, leaning back in his chair and squinting. "Were you awake? Or were you busy with your chores again?" Brian glanced at him, tired but not annoyed. He respected Danny, his forthrightness, his ability to tell the truth even when it cut like a knife. But he wasn't ready to share today, not after what he'd seen yesterday. Instead of answering, he shrugged and muttered, "Just had a rough night. Let's talk about work." Danny didn't press the issue, but his eyes said he wasn't buying it. They started going over the details of the new case, but Brian was distracted, his fingers mechanically leafing through the file, his mind far away in the office of Alexander Martin, the lawyer whose profile he'd found in the police database. He decided he'd stop by after his shift, not to talk, but just to see, to get a feel for this man who seemed to have stolen his wife. But before that, he wanted to do one more thing: check if Emma had left any traces in their shared cloud, where she kept documents and photos. Maybe there was something he'd missed. At lunchtime, when Danny had gone to get sandwiches, Brian opened his laptop and logged into their cloud storage. He knew the password their anniversary, which now seemed like a taunt. Scrolling through the folders, he found one labeled simply "Personal," created 3 months ago. His heart pounded as he opened it. There were pictures, dozens of them, taken by Emma. Most of them were of her, in restaurants, in bars, walking through Central Park, and almost always with a man he now recognized. Tall, with a neat beard, wearing expensive suits. In one picture, they were sitting at a table in the Belle Epoque, the same restaurant whose receipt he'd found in her purse. Emma was laughing, her eyes shining, and Alex was looking at her with such tenderness that Brian felt his fists clench. Another picture of them on the Hudson River, embracing against the sunset, her hand on his chest, just like the day before Moonlight Loungebrian saved the pictures to a flash drive, not because he needed more evidence, but because he couldn't stop. It was like an addiction, like a need to complete the investigation. Back at work, he felt like a robot, going through the motions. Interviewing a witness, filling out a report, discussing with Danny, all of it passed him by like noise outside the window. His mind was occupied with only one thing. That evening, he would drive to Alexander Martin's office. He found the firm's address in the database, a skyscraper on Wall Street, where the law firm was located. Martin and Associates Brian didn't know what he expected from this trip, but he felt he needed to see this man, to understand what he was like, before he decided how to proceed. When his shift ended, Brian got in his car and headed toward the financial district. Wall Street was busy, but not hectic in the evening hours. with businessmen in suits hurrying to meetings or to bars, and the skyscrapers glittering in the light of the setting sun. He parked across the street from the building where Martin's firm was located and pulled out his camera again. He felt miserable sitting in the car with the lens trained on the glass doors, but it was the only thing that gave him a sense of control. He waited, watching people come and go, until finally he saw him, Alexander Martin, in a dark gray suit, briefcase in hand, walking out of the building, accompanied by two colleagues. He looked just like the photo in the database, confident, upright, with an easy smile that seemed to be part of his image. Brian took a few pictures, but what caught his attention was the figure that appeared next. Emma, wearing the same dark blue dress as that morning, with a handbag over her shoulder, approached Alex, and they exchanged a brief but warm glance before he opened the door of that very Mercedes for her. Brian didn't follow them. He knew where they were going, probably to Moonlight Lounge or to another bar, where they would laugh, hug, kiss, as if their lives were a romantic comedy and not a tragedy unfolding in the heart of another. Instead, he sat there, staring at the building until the lights in the windows began to fade. He felt empty, but not broken, not yet. His mind, accustomed to strategies, was already plotting the next step, talking to Emma. He couldn't put it off any longer. The photos, the receipts, the calls, they were all enough to start a dialogue, but he was afraid that the words he heard would be the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. When he got home, he found Emma in the living room, sitting on the sofa with a glass of wine. She smiled at him, but it was a tired smile, as if she, too, was carrying a burden. "You're late," she said, setting her glass down on the table. "On duty again?" "Yes," he lied, and the lie was bitter because he had never lied to her before. "And you? How's the project going?" "Oh, almost done," she said, and her voice was too light, too rehearsed. "It'll get easier soon." Brian nodded, but his gaze slid to her purse, where he noticed the edge of a new check sticking out of her pocket. He didn't ask, didn't touch it. Instead, he said, "I'm tired, Em. I'm going to bed." She looked at him, and something flickered in her eyes, regret, guilt, or maybe just weariness. But she only nodded. "Good night, Brian." He went to bed, but sleep would not come. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would talk to her, put the photographs on the table, ask about Alex, about the bars, about the lies. But for now he lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the shadow of the truth hanging over him, heavy and inescapable. The evening in their Upper West Side apartment, where every corner had once been filled with memories of dinners together, spontaneous trips out of town, and those quiet nights when they simply lay in each other's arms, discussing plans for the future, now seemed to Brian McKinley like a coiled spring, ready to snap and shatter into 1,000 pieces, because the air between him and Emma was saturated with unspoken words, heavy as lead, and he knew that today, finally, he had to let them out. Otherwise, they would corrode him from the inside, like acid, slowly but surely. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into his cold coffee, which he hadn't even finished because his throat was so tight with worry, and Emma, who had returned from work only half an hour ago, was bustling about at the stove, making pasta that she liked to season with basil and parmesan. But today her movements were nervous, as if she sensed a storm coming, and Brian, with his trained investigator's eye, noticed every little thing. The way her fingers trembled slightly when she cut the tomatoes, the way she avoided looking him in the eye, preferring to chat about trivial things like the weather or the new client at the agency. But he couldn't play this game of pretend anymore, where they both pretended that everything was fine, although inside he was seething from those photos he had seen, from those hugs and kisses that were burning in his memory. Brian cleared his throat, set his cup down on the table with a soft thud that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen, and finally said, trying to keep his voice level even though everything inside was raging, "Emma, we need to talk. Seriously, without the excuses about work or being tired." She paused for a moment, the knife in her hand hovering over the board, and he saw her shoulders tense. But then she turned to him with that smile he had once loved for its sincerity, but which now seemed to him like a mask, artfully put on to hide what lay beneath. and she answered, trying to sound casual, as if this were an ordinary evening conversation. About what, Brian? You look as if you are about to interrogate me. Is your work business bothering you again? Tell me, maybe it will make you feel better. He shook his head, feeling irritation building because she was already trying to steer the conversation away, as she had been doing for weeks when he asked about her late nights, and he decided not to back down, pulled a folded piece of paper with a printed photograph from his pocket, the one where she was hugging Alex by the car, and put it on the table, smoothing it with his palm so that she could see all the details. Her laughing eyes, his hand on her waist, and said, looking straight into her face to catch the slightest reaction, "This is not about my work, Emma. This is about us. About you. Who is this man? I saw you yesterday at Moonlight Lounge. I saw you kissing. Don't lie to me, please. I deserve the truth." Emma stared at the photo, her face going pale for a moment, but then she quickly pulled herself together, pushed the paper away as if it was some kind of trivial matter, not worth noticing, and answered, her voice slightly higher, with a hint of irritation that she was trying to hide under a mask of resentment. "Brian, are you serious? You were following me? Taking pictures like some kind of private detective? That's paranoid. You're always like this. With your job, you see suspicion, intrigue, betrayal everywhere. And this is just a colleague, Alex. We were discussing a project. He gave me a ride after a meeting. And yes, we hugged goodbye. But did we kiss? You must have mixed up the two. The light was bad, or the shadows played a trick on you. Do you really think I'm cheating on you?" Her words hit him like a slap in the face. Because there was some truth in them, his profession did make him suspicious. But he knew what he had seen, knew that the pictures didn't lie, and he didn't back down. He pushed the paper closer to her and went on, his voice harder, with a hint of pain he could no longer hide. "A colleague, Alex Martin, the Wall Street lawyer. You work in marketing, Emma. What projects do you have together?" "I checked him out, yes, I checked him out, because you lied to me about your evenings out, about girlfriends and work late. I found receipts from restaurants we've never been to, calls to him at midnight when I'm not home, and the pictures in our cloud you on the promenade, in the park, everywhere together, and you look happier, Emma, happier than you have with me in years. Tell me the truth. Is this an affair? How long has it been going on?" She turned away, returning to the stove, but he saw her hands tremble even more, and she turned off the heat, as if she couldn't continue cooking under such pressure, and answered without turning around, her voice quieter, but there was aggression in it, as if she were defending herself from an unfair accusation. "Have you checked it? Our cloud? Brian, this is too much. You're invading my privacy, as if I'm a suspect in your case. Yes, Alex is a friend, a good friend, he helps me with things, listens when I need to talk, because you're always at work, always in your head about criminals and chases, and I'm here alone, waiting for you at night. And yes, we meet sometimes, drink coffee, chat, but this is not an affair, not what you think. You're paranoid, Brian, your work has broken you, you see lies everywhere. Maybe it's your fault that I seek support from others." Brian felt her words pierce him. Because they were true, he really had been preoccupied with his work. He really had left her alone too often, but that didn't justify the lies, didn't justify the kisses he'd seen with his own eyes, and he stood up, came closer, trying not to raise his voice, even though everything inside was boiling. "Support. Hugs, kisses, is that support? I saw you, Emma, not in a photograph, but in person. Yesterday, at the bar. You were clinging to him, kissing him back, as if it were the most natural thing to do. And in the cloud, there are dozens of pictures where you look like a couple on your honeymoon. Tell me honestly, do you love him? Is this the end for us?" She finally turned around, her green eyes, the same ones that had once captivated him, now shining with tears or anger, he couldn't tell, and she answered, her voice choppy, pauses, as if each word was difficult for her. "Love, Brian, you're crazy. Alex, he gets me, listens, doesn't judge me like you do now. We're friends, close friends, maybe flirt a little sometimes, but it doesn't mean anything. It's your fault I feel alone in our marriage. Always suspicious, always probing, and now you're stalking. That's not love, that's control. If you don't trust me, what's the point of going on? He took a step back, feeling her accusations hit home, because yes, he was controlling, yes, he was digging, but only because the truth was burning in him, and he couldn't believe her words because they didn't match the facts, the clues he'd pieced together like a puzzle, and he said, trying to sound calm even though his voice was shaking, flirting. It's more than flirting, Emma. I found a text on your phone. Meet me at Moonlight at 9 p.m. Wear something sexy. It's from him. And the bartender said you were there a lot, cuddling and leaving together. If this is friendship, why are you lying to me about Sarah, about the projects? Why do you hide your phone in the bathroom? I'm not paranoid, I just see what you're hiding. Emma wiped her hands on her apron, her face twisted in irritation, and she answered, raising her voice as if it were her only defense, a text message. You went through my phone? Brian, that's too much. Yes, Alex wrote that, but it was a joke, a flirtation, nothing serious. We don't sleep together, if that's what you mean. And the phone is in the bathroom because I want privacy. I want to answer texts without you looking at me suspiciously. You've turned our house into a prison with interrogations and surveillance. Maybe if you were home more often, if you listened to me and not your cop instincts, I wouldn't need friends like Alex. You accuse me of being paranoid, but you're the one being paranoid. Brian felt his resolve weaken as her words sowed doubts. Maybe he was exaggerating. Maybe this was just a flirtatious friendship brought on by his absence. But then he remembered the kiss, that passionate kiss by the car, and the doubts receded, and he said, stepping closer so she could see the pain in his eyes. A joke. Flirting. Emma, I love you, or I did, but this is not a joke. I saw you kiss him, not as a friend. If this is true, tell me, and we'll figure it out, maybe therapy, maybe a break, but don't lie. Because if I keep digging, if I find more, there's no going back. Our marriage will fall apart, and it will be on you. She paused, looking at him, and something flickered in her eyes, guilt, fear, regret. But then she shook her head, her voice quieter, almost a whisper. Dig, Brian. If you don't believe me, dig. But know that it will destroy us. I'm not cheating on you, but your suspicions are already destroying everything. Maybe we need a break, for you to think about whether you want to live with a woman or a suspect. He stood there looking at her and knew she was avoiding direct answers, blaming him, shifting the blame, and he didn't believe a word of it. But at the same time, he felt like if he continued, there really would be no going back: divorce, loneliness, an empty apartment, and he nodded silently, turned and went into the bedroom, leaving her alone with the pasta cooling on the stove and a storm raging inside him because the truth was close, but the price for it seemed too high. But even lying in bed, he knew he would not stop his nature as an investigator. His pain, his love, or what was left of it, pushed him forward into the depths from which there was no return, and the night seemed endless, full of whispered conversations that did not solve anything, only deepened the abyss between them. Brian McKinley's apartment, usually filled with morning warmth from the sun shining through the curtains, now felt cold and alien to him, as if the space itself had absorbed the tension that had hung between him and Emma since their conversation the night before, when the words spoken in hushed tones had resolved nothing but deepened the gulf between them. He sat on the couch, clutching a mug of coffee that he didn't even drink, because his throat was so tight with the mixture of anger, pain, and exhaustion that had been building up inside him like poison with each new revelation about Emma's life, about which he knew so little, despite 10 years of marriage. Her accusations of paranoia, her evasive answers, her look of either guilt or hurt, it all played in his head like a broken record, but he couldn't stop, couldn't just accept her words and move on, because his detective instincts, honed by years of working in a New York police station, screamed that the truth was out there and it wasn't going to be pretty. Emma left for work early, throwing the usual, "See you tonight, don't be late," over her shoulder, but there was none of the lightness in her voice that he had once loved, and her steps down the hallway were hurried, as if she were running not from him, but from herself. Brian waited until the door slammed shut before he allowed himself to exhale, feeling his resolve, eroded by the conversation the day before, begin to build again. He didn't believe a word she said about her friendship with Alex, about flirting that meant nothing, because the photos he had taken of her moonlight lounge and the ones he found in their cloud storage spoke louder than any excuse. But now he needed more, not just proof, but a name, a face, a motive. He wanted to know who this man was who had taken his place in Emma's heart and why she had chosen him. Brian opened his laptop and logged back into the police database, knowing it was a breach of protocol, but his personal pain outweighed his professional ethics. He typed in the name Alexander Martin, the Wall Street lawyer whose profile he'd found the day before, and began digging deeper, checking connections, cases, addresses. His fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, but his heart was pounding as if he were about to arrest a dangerous suspect. The database returned more information. Alexander Martin, 38, senior partner at Martin and Associates, a corporate lawyer with a reputation as a tough negotiator and connections in New York's upper crust. But what stopped Brian in his tracks was Martin's involvement in a case he'd been working on for the past 3 months, an investigation into financial fraud involving money laundering through a network of offshore companies. Martin wasn't the primary suspect, but his firm represented one of the key figures, a man named Vincent Collar, a businessman whose real estate empire was in the crosshairs of the Financial Crimes Unit. Brian leaned back against the couch, his blood running cold. This couldn't be a coincidence. Alex Martin, the man Emma had spent her evenings with, the man he'd seen kissing, was involved in a case that was taking up half his time, a case where the stakes were high and the suspects dangerous. His mind began to spin, connecting the dots. Emma, working for a marketing agency that did business with major corporations. Martin, representing Collar, and himself, a cop digging into a financial scheme in which Collar was the central figure. It was too much to be a coincidence, and Brian felt like his personal life and professional career, which he'd always tried to keep separate, were now entwined in a tight knot that would be nearly impossible to untie. He decided to act quickly. The first thing he did was call Danny Corso, his partner, who, despite his warnings not to interfere, was the only person Brian could trust. Danny answered on the second ring, his voice hoarse, as if he had just woken up. "Mac, why are you up so early? Haven't you slept again?" "Danny, I need your help," Brian said, trying to keep his voice calm even though he was seething inside. "It's about the Collar case. Do you know Alexander Martin, the lawyer?" Danny paused, and Brian heard him clear his throat before answering. "Martin. Yes, I heard. His firm is defending Collar. A slippery type, but smart, knows how to cover for a client. What's wrong with him? Did he find something new?" Brian hesitated, knowing that if he told the truth, he would be crossing a line where his personal drama would become part of his job, but he saw no other way out. "It's not just about the case, Danny. He's involved with Emma. I've seen them together, and it's not just friendship. I think she's seeing him, and I need to know if it's connected to Collar. Maybe she's in trouble without realizing it." There was silence on the other end of the line, so long that Brian thought the connection had been cut off. But then Danny spoke, his voice low, almost menacing. "Mac, do you realize what you're doing? You're mixing personal and professional. If Martin is involved with Emma, that's one thing, but if you start digging into his connection to Collar using inside resources, it could cost you your badge. Are you sure you want to go down this path?" "I'm not sure of anything," Brian admitted, his voice breaking, betraying the pain he was trying to hide. "But I can't stop Danny. If she's involved, if Martin is using her to get to me or the investigation, I need to know. Help me, even if only informally. See if Martin has anything that can connect him to Emma other than what I saw." Danny sighed, and Brian imagined him chewing on his toothpick, considering his words. "Okay, Mac," he said finally. "I'll see what I can find, but I'll keep it off the record. And you keep a tight rein on yourself, okay? Don't mess with Martin, don't make a scene. If he's involved with Collar, they're dangerous people, and you don't want Emma in their crosshairs. Give me a few days." "Thank you, Danny," Brian said, feeling some of the weight lift from his shoulders, but only for a moment, because the truth he was seeking now seemed even more sinister. The rest of the day at the station was strangely tense. Brian tried to focus on the collar case, but every document, every line of the reports seemed to be tied to Emma now. He reread witness statements, names of intermediaries, phone records, hoping to find some hint that Martin might be using Emma as a pawn in Collar's game. But there was nothing concrete, only his own suspicions, growing like a shadow in the sunset light. He felt on the edge, between a husband who wanted to save his marriage and a cop who had to protect the investigation, even if it meant ruining his personal life. In the evening, he decided to take another step. He knew that Emma would be late again today, and instead of following her, he headed towards the office Martin and Associates in Wall Street. He didn't plan to go inside or confront him, that would have been too risky, but he wanted to see Martin, to feel him out, the way an investigator might feel a suspect he hasn't caught yet. He parked in an alley, pulled out his camera, and waited, watching the glass doors of the skyscraper. An hour later, Martin emerged, just like the day before, in an impeccable suit, with a briefcase in his hand, but this time he was alone. Brian took a few pictures, capturing his confident gait, his casual smile, as if the whole world was at his feet. But something in his behavior alerted Brian. Martin stopped at the car, took out his phone and started talking, looking around, as if he was afraid of being followed. Brian, sitting in his Honda, felt the adrenaline rushing to his temples. It was the same instinct that helped him solve cases. Martin was hiding something, and it was more than just an affair with Emma. After Martin left, Brian sat there, considering his next move. He knew that if he kept digging, he might stumble across something that would connect his personal life to the collar case, and then things would get even more complicated. But he couldn't back out, not when the truth was so close, hidden in details he hadn't yet managed to piece together. He started the car and drove home, feeling his world, once so clear, crumbling, weaving love, betrayal, and danger into one unbreakable web. The darkness in Brian McKinley's apartment was almost tangible, as if the night that had fallen over New York had seeped through the walls and filled every corner, mirroring the chaos inside him, where anger, pain, and a thirst for truth fought for control, leaving him on a line he had never crossed before. He sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him, the profile of Alexander Martin, the lawyer whose name was now synonymous with betrayal, still visible on the screen, his badge lying on the table like a silent rebuke to the oath he had taken 15 years earlier, promising to uphold the law and not use it as a weapon for personal vendetta. After discovering that Martin was connected to the Vincent Collar case, the investigation of which consumed his days and nights, Brian felt like his world, once clearly divided between work and home, had now turned into a tangled mess, where every step could either be salvation or a fall into an abyss from which there was no return. He hadn't slept for 2 nights, his eyes bloodshot with fatigue, his mind racing between the husband who wanted Emma back and the investigator who saw Martin not only as his wife's lover, but also as a potential threat, possibly connected to the criminal scheme he was investigating. The conversation with Danny, his partner, from the night before echoed in his head. "You're mixing personal with work. This could cost you your badge." Danny was right, but the truth Brian was looking for was no longer just personal. It was about a case with higher stakes than his broken marriage. If Martin was using Emma to manipulate him, to slow down the investigation, or even to gain access to information, then it was more than just cheating. It was something far more dangerous. But how far was he willing to go to find out the truth? Was he willing to break the law he was sworn to uphold to catch the man who had stolen his life? Brian stood and paced the kitchen, his footsteps hollow in the empty apartment where Emma, as expected, had failed to return for dinner again, sending a short text. "I'll be late, don't wait up." He felt trapped, where every choice was wrong. Keep quiet and live with the lie, talk to Emma and risk ruining their marriage forever, or use his authority to dig deeper into Martin's life, risking his career and perhaps Emma's safety if she was truly embroiled in Collar's business. He walked back to the table and picked up the badge, feeling its cold metal, and remembered the day it had been given to him, a day filled with pride, when he had felt that his work had meaning, that he was making the world a better place. Now the badge seemed less like a badge of honor and more like a tool he could use to destroy Martin or himself. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. It was Danny, and his voice, as always, was a mixture of weariness and sarcasm. "Mac, are you nuts yet? I dug into what you asked for. Martin isn't just Collar's lawyer. His firm, Martin and Associates, is involved in several of the deals we're looking into. Nothing concrete to pin on him, but there are rumors that he's not only protecting Collar, but helping him cover his tracks. Phone records we obtained through a warrant show him making frequent calls to offshore numbers. And yes, your name came up in conversations with our informant. It seems Collar knows you're on his tail. But here's the weird thing. Emma's name doesn't come up anywhere. If she's connected to Martin, it's only on a personal level. No trace of her in the case." Brian clutched the phone, feeling his pulse quicken. "So you're saying Martin may be dirty, but Emma is just his personal interest?" "Maybe," Danny said, and there was caution in his voice. "But Mac, I'm serious. Don't get too caught up in this. If you start using the base to spy on Martin because of Emma, it's going to come out. The chief's already looking at you, saying you're absent-minded. One wrong move and you're on the hook for internal affairs. What are you going to do? Go after Martin with a gun and a badge, like in the movies?" Brian chuckled, but it was as bitter as his coffee. "I'm not going to wave a gun, Danny, but I can't just sit here and watch him ruin my life. If he's involved with Collar and Emma is with him, I need to know if he's got her into something. She's lying to me, but maybe she doesn't even know what she's gotten herself into." "What if she understands?" Danny asked, his question hanging in the air like a blow. "What if she's with him not because he cheated on her, but because she's better off with him? Are you prepared for that answer?" Brian paused, feeling Danny's words hit him where it hurt most. He wasn't ready, but he knew he couldn't stop. "I have to know, Danny, even if the truth kills me." "Then be careful," Danny said, his voice softening. "I'll cover for you where I can, but don't do anything stupid. Check Martin out through open sources, through his firm, but don't go into the database without a warrant. And talk to Emma Mack, not as a cop, but as a husband. Maybe she'll tell you more than you think." Brian thanked her and hung up, but Danny's words did nothing to calm him down, instead adding fuel to the fire. He opened his laptop and began searching for information about Martin in the public domain. Articles in business magazines, mentions on social media, a company profile. Martin was a Wall Street star, charismatic, successful, with a reputation for getting what he wanted. One article mentioned his attendance at a charity gala where he had been spotted with a glamorous companion, and Brian zoomed in on the photo and recognized Emma in the black dress he had seen in their closet. That had been 3 months ago, just when he had begun to notice the changes in her demeanor. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and he felt his anger turn to despair. She wasn't just dating Martin, she was living another life he didn't know about. But the most disturbing discovery was waiting for him in the police database, where he returned despite Danny's warnings. He entered a query to cross-reference Martin and Collar's data and found an old report that mentioned a meeting between Martin and a man the informant said was connected to Collar's offshore accounts. The meeting took place in the Belle Epoque, the same restaurant whose receipt Brian had found in Emma's purse. It didn't prove Emma was involved in Collar's business, but the coincidence was a siren call. Brian felt his resolve crystallize. He had to use his authority to find out how deeply Martin was involved, even if it meant breaking protocol. He knew he could request a wiretap on Martin's phone, citing the Collar case, but that would require a warrant, and a warrant would require a justification he couldn't provide without risking his own motives. Another option was unofficial surveillance, but that, too, was a slippery slope. If he were caught, he would lose not only his career, but any hope of the truth. He remembered the words of his oath, to serve and to protect. But who was he protecting now? Emma, who had lied to him, himself in the pain that was tearing him apart, or the law he might break for revenge? The conflict within him reached its peak as he sat at the station, staring at the screen where the data on Martin and Collar stared back at him like a challenge. He could request access to more records, but that would mean crossing the line where he was no longer just a cop with personal problems, but a man using the law as a tool for revenge. He closed the laptop, his hands shaking, and stepped outside, where the cold New York air hit him in the face like a slap. He knew he had to make a decision, either back down, talk to Emma, like Danny had advised, or push through, even if it meant ruining everything. That evening, he returned home, where Emma, to his surprise, was at home, sitting on the sofa with a glass of wine, just like the night they had first quarreled over his suspicions. She looked at him, and a flicker of worry flashed in her eyes, but she quickly hid it behind a smile. "You're early, Brian. Would you like some wine?" I opened what we brought from Tuscany. He shook his head, feeling his insides tighten. "Emma, we need to finish this conversation. I know who he is. Alexander Martin, the lawyer, and I know he's connected to the case I'm working on. If you're involved in this, tell me now before it gets worse." Her face went pale, the glass froze in her hand, but she quickly pulled herself together. "You again? Brian, this is not paranoia anymore. This is an obsession. Yes, I know Alex, I told you, he is a friend. And the fact that he is connected with your work is your fantasy. Stop seeing conspiracies everywhere." "This is not fantasy," he said, and his voice was cold as steel. "I've seen the documents. He's working with the man I'm investigating. And you're with him, Emma. If you're just his mistress, that's one thing. But if you're involved in his business, that's another. Tell me the truth, or I'll find out for myself." She stood up, her eyes flashing with anger. "Find out, Brian. But when you ruin everything, don't blame me. I'm not cheating on you, and I'm not a criminal. And you're not a husband anymore. You're an investigator who sees enemies even in his own wife." She went into the bedroom, slamming the door, and Brian stood there, feeling the line between the law and personal vengeance growing thinner. He knew that if he crossed it, he would lose either Emma or himself. But the truth, hidden in the details, was too close to stop. That evening, when New York, this restless giant of concrete and lights, seemed to hold its breath under low clouds, foreshadowing a storm that was about to break over Manhattan, Brian McKinley, exhausted by weeks of sleepless nights, where his mind, like a tireless hunter, pursued the shadows of betrayal and deceit, finally decided that it was time to put an end to this exhausting pursuit of the truth that turned his life into a labyrinth of suspicion and pain, where every turn could lead either to salvation or to complete collapse. And he, sitting in his battered Honda in front of an elite restaurant, the Belle Epoque, where it all began with that ill-fated check found in Emma's purse, he felt his heart beat in unison with the approaching thunder, because today he had set a trap, cunning and multifaceted, like the web of a spider waiting for its prey, where the personal and the professional would intertwine into one inseparable knot, exposing not only treason, but also, perhaps, a crime that could cost him everything he once valued. Brian hadn't just been waiting, he'd been planning this for days, ever since that conversation with Danny, when his partner, with his toothpick in his mouth and his eyes full of tired wisdom, had warned, "Mac, if you step over the line, there's no turning back. You'll lose your badge and maybe your soul." But Brian, already scarred by visions of Emma in the arms of Alexander Martin, the same lawyer whose firm had covered up Vincent Coller's machinations, couldn't stop because the truth, that wily lady, was beckoning him forward, promising freedom from doubt, even if the price was prohibitive. He used his connections at the station unofficially, of course, so as not to arouse the suspicions of the chief, who was already looking askance at his absent-mindedness, and arranged a meeting, luring Martin under the pretext of an anonymous informant willing to share details about Collar, and Emma through a fake message from a client who supposedly wanted to discuss a marketing project in the same restaurant where he and Martin often met. And all this was supposed to come together at one moment in one room, where the truth would burst into the light like lightning from the clouds, illuminating all the hidden corners of their lives. Restaurant the Belle Epoque, with its ornate chandeliers twinkling like the stars in the Parisian sky, and its tables covered with snow-white tablecloths, where the aroma of French cuisine mingled with the whispers of couples in love and business negotiations, was the perfect place for such a climax, because it was here, as Brian learned from the receipts and photographs, that Emma and Martin had begun their secret story, and it was here that he decided to finish it, sitting in the car across the street with his phone in his hand, where the bugging app was blinking yes. He had crossed the line, having installed the device in the room through a waiter he knew, risking everything, but feeling that this was the only way to catch them both at the same time in a personal and criminal sense. Because if Martin was really dirty, as Danny suspected, then the conversation today could provide evidence, and if Emma was involved, her reaction would give everything away. Emma was the first to appear, stepping out of a taxi in the same low-cut black dress Brian had given her for their anniversary, the one he now associated with betrayal, her chestnut hair falling in waves around her shoulders and her green eyes, the same emeralds that had once captivated him, now wary, as if she sensed a catch. But she walked into the restaurant anyway, graceful as ever, and Brian, watching through the window, felt a twinge of pain mixed with determination, because this was his Emma, the woman he loved, but who now seemed like a stranger, hiding secrets that could destroy them both. A few minutes later, Martin pulled up in his black Mercedes, dressed in an impeccable suit, with that confident smile that made him look like a shark in the business world, and he walked in too, unaware that today his world was about to be turned upside down. Brian put on his headphones, tapping into the wiretap, and his heart began to pound as he heard the noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the muffled conversations, the jazz music in the background, and then Emma's voice, soft but with a hint of impatience. "Alex, what's the urgency? You said it was important, but I can't stay. Brian's become so suspicious. He grilled me again yesterday, like he was interrogating me, and I'm afraid he knows something." Martin answered, his voice calm, but with a hint of tension that Brian caught right away, like an investigator used to picking out lies in intonations. "Emma, honey, calm down. I just wanted to see you. But yes, there is something to discuss. Your husband is a cop, prosecuting my client, caller, and I need to know if he mentioned anything at home, any details, because if he is close, it could affect both of us, and I don't want you to get hurt because of that." Emma was silent for a moment, and Brian imagined her frowning, her green eyes narrowing, and then she answered, her voice quieter, almost a whisper, "Alex, are you using me? I thought it was just us, our connection, but if you're asking me to spy on Brian, that's too much. I love you, but I don't want to get involved in your business with Collar. He's dangerous. You said yourself that he doesn't mess with those who cross him." Martin laughed quietly, but there was a falseness in it that Brian could feel even through the headphones. "Sweetheart, no one is talking about spying. Just tell me if he mentioned Collar or the firm. It's for our safety. I protect you as well as Collar, and if Brian digs too deep, then I can help him. Understand that it's better to back off. I have connections that can make sure the case is closed, or that it is transferred to another one." Brian froze in the car, his fists clenched on the steering wheel, because this was it, the admission that Martin wasn't just a lawyer, but a participant in the scheme, and that he was willing to use Emma to influence the investigation, and his anger flared like lightning, illuminating everything. Emma had been drawn in, even if she hadn't fully realized it, but her words, "I love you," had hit him harder than any evidence, because it was confirmation of infidelity, and he couldn't wait any longer. He got out of the car, feeling the rain begin to pound the asphalt, and headed for the restaurant where everything was going to be revealed. Inside, the Belle Epoquette air was thick with the scent of truffles and wine, but to Brian it was the scent of betrayal, and he walked past the maitre d', ignoring his question, "Sir, do you have a reservation?" and went straight to the table in the corner where Emma and Martin were sitting, their heads close together like lovers whispering secrets. And as he approached, Emma looked up and her face went pale, as if she had seen a ghost. "Brian, what are you doing here? Are you following me again?" Martin turned, his smile frozen into a wary mask, and he said, trying to sound confident, but Brian could hear the tremor in his voice, "Mr. McKinley, I presume? Is this a family matter, or are you here on business? If business, I have a lawyer. Ha ha, wait, that's me." Brian stood looking at them, rain running down his hair, and he answered, his voice as hard as steel, but his insides seething with emotion. "It's both, Martin. I heard you talking, yes, I wiretapped you, and it may cost me my badge, but I should have known, and I know now. You're not just my wife's lover, You're using her to get to me, to get to the collar case, and it's not personal anymore, it's criminal, because bribery, threats, manipulation of an investigation, these are crimes, and I will arrest you right here if I have to." Emma jumped up, her glass knocked over, wine spilling across the tablecloth like blood, and she screamed, her voice shaking with shock and anger. "Brian, are you crazy? A wiretap. You broke the law because you were jealous. Alex isn't using me. We're in love. And yes, he mentioned caller, but I didn't know it was about you. I thought it was just his client, and if you were following us, then you're the one who's the criminal, not him." Martin stood up slowly, his eyes narrowed, and he said, lowering his voice so as not to attract the attention of the other customers who were already beginning to glance at them, "McKinley, you're bluffing. You have no evidence, and if you do, it was obtained illegally. I'm a lawyer. I'll beat you in court, and your wife, she chose me because you make her feel like she's in prison with your interrogations and surveillance. So leave before you make things worse." Brian took out his phone, turned on the wiretap, and Martin and Emma's voices filled the space between them. "If Brian is digging too deep, then I can help him understand that it's better to back off. And Emma, I love you." And the room was silent, interrupted only by the rain outside the window, and Emma sank into a chair, her face distorted with horror. "Brian, please, it's not what you think. I didn't want you to find out like this, but yes, I love Alex, because with him I feel alive, and with you it's routine, work, suspicion, and if he's involved in something, then I didn't know, I swear, I just wanted happiness." Martin grabbed the briefcase, trying to leave, but Brian blocked his way, his voice getting louder, attracting the attention of the maitre d'. "You're not going anywhere, Martin. I'm calling for backup. You're under arrest for attempting to obstruct the investigation, and possibly for complicity in the laundering of Collar's money, and Emma, if you were covering for him, then you will be questioned too, because this isn't just treason, this is a betrayal of everything I believed in." Emma began to cry, her tears falling onto the tablecloth, mixing with the wine, and she said, her voice breaking with sobs, "Brian, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to end this way. I loved you. But you were always at work, always busy, and Alex, he listened. He was there. And yes, he asked me to ask about your work. But I thought it was just curiosity. Please don't arrest him. Don't ruin everything." Martin, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, tried to push Brian away, but Brian, with the reflexes of a cop, grabbed his arm. "Don't move, Martin, or I'll add resisting arrest, and believe me, I have a search warrant for your company, which I'll get in an hour, because your calls to offshore companies, your meetings, all this is already in the case, and Emma, if you knew, then you're an accomplice." At that moment, Danny ran into the restaurant with two officers that Brian had called in advance, and Danny said, his eyes full of regret, "Mac, you did it after all, okay, Martin, you're under arrest, and Emma, you'll have to come with us for questioning." Emma looked at Brian. Her eyes were full of pain and anger. "You destroyed us, Brian. I will never forgive you, even if Alex is guilty. You could have talked instead of setting this trap. You are not a husband. You are a monster." Martin, putting on the handcuffs, said with a grin, but there was fear in his voice, "You won't prove anything, McKinley. My lawyer will break you, and Emma, she will be with me when it's all over." Brian stood watching them being led away, the rain lashing the windows like tears against his soul, and he knew that everything had come out that night: Emma's betrayal, Martin's crimes, his own breach of the line, and now that the trap had sprung, he felt not triumph but emptiness, because the truth he had craved had been as bitter as the rain washing away the illusions of their lives. But the evening wasn't over, because at the station where they were taken, things got even worse. Emma, sitting in the interrogation room, finally broke down and said, her voice quiet, broken, "Yeah, I knew Alex was involved with Collar, he told me, asked me to give Brian a hint to back off, but I didn't want to. I loved him, and I thought it would protect us. I'm sorry, Brian. I didn't want you to get hurt." Martin, in the next room, denied everything, but the wiretaps and documents Brian had collected were irrefutable, and Danny told Brian, clapping him on the shoulder, "You got them, Mac, but the price is high. The chief will find out about the wiretap, and you might lose your badge, but damn, you solved the collar case through that. Brian nodded, but inside he was empty, because the revelation, this climax where the personal and the criminal had intertwined in one evening, had brought no relief, only pain, and he had walked out of the station in the rain, feeling like his world, once full of love and duty, was now in ruins, and the road ahead would be long and lonely. The rain that lashed against the windows of the Manhattan police station seemed to show no sign of letting up, as if the sky had decided to wash away all traces of that fateful evening when Brian McKinley, a man whose life had once been built on principles of honor and duty, had crossed a line he had promised never to cross, and now, sitting in his office, surrounded by gray walls permeated with the smell of coffee and old files, he felt his world, already cracked by the revelation of Emma and Alexander Martin, crumbling completely because the truth he had so desperately sought was not liberation, but a heavy burden that was dragging him down, dragging with it everything he valued: his marriage, his career, his reputation. The station was buzzing like a beehive, but today the noise seemed muffled to Brian, as if he were listening from underwater. The colleagues who usually taunted him or discussed business over their morning coffee were now whispering and giving him sideways glances, and he knew why. Word of his unofficial wiretapping, of how he had used police resources to catch his wife's lover, had spread faster than he had expected, and although the Vincent Collar case had received a new boost from the tapes in which Martin had effectively admitted his involvement in the attempts to obstruct the investigation, Brian knew that the price of that success would be measured not only in personal pain, but in professional ruin. His badge, lying on the desk in front of him, seemed less a symbol of pride than a reminder of how far he had gone, breaking his oath for a vengeance that had proven to bring neither relief nor satisfaction. The morning began with a call to the chief, Captain Richards, whose office on the third floor of the station was like a fortress where decisions were made that would break lives. Richards, a man of about 50 with gray hair at the temples and a look that could pierce through you, sat at his desk, holding a report compiled by the Internal Service, and his voice, when he spoke, was cold as steel. "McKinley, do you realize the shit you've gotten yourself into? Wiretapping without a warrant, using a database for personal gain, spying on a civilian unrelated to the case until you made him one. You gave us evidence against Martin, yes, but at what price? Internal Affairs is already breathing down my neck, demanding your head. What do you have to say for yourself?" Brian, standing in front of the table, felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to speak, trying to keep his voice from shaking, although inside he was seething with shame and anger at himself, at Emma, at Martin. "Sir, I admit I crossed a line. But Martin was involved with Collar, and I suspected that my wife, Emma, might be drawn into his schemes. I couldn't risk her becoming an accomplice, or that Martin would use her to sabotage the investigation. The wiretap was an impulsive decision, but it worked. Without it, we wouldn't have gotten Martin's confession." Richards leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed, and he answered, slowly, as if each word were a blow. "The result? You think that justifies breaking the law? You're not just a cop, McKinley. You were one of the best. But now you've put not only yourself, but the entire department in jeopardy. If Martin's lawyers find out how you got those tapes, they'll ruin the case in court, and Collar will go away again. And you're under investigation. Internal Affairs wants you out, and I'm not sure I can cover for you. Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you play by the rules?" Brian looked down, feeling the boss's words cut like a knife. "Because it was personal, sir. I lost control. Emma. She was cheating on me with Martin, and I couldn't think straight. I wanted the truth, and I got it, but I know I paid too much for it." Richards shook his head, his face softening, but only for a moment. "Personal matters shouldn't interfere with work, Mac. You knew that better than anyone. Go home, you're suspended until Internal Affairs gets a handle on it. And pray that Martin doesn't sue for breach of confidentiality. If the Collar case falls apart because of you, it'll be on you." Brian walked out of the office, feeling like the floor was slipping under his feet. The precinct, the place where he had spent half his life, now seemed hostile, and the colleagues who had previously clapped him on the shoulder now avoided his gaze. Danny, the only one left, was waiting for him at the exit, his toothpick moving nervously in his mouth. "Mac, I warned you, damn it. You got Martin, but at what price? The boss is ranting and raving, and the guys are saying you were using the precinct as a personal arsenal. What now? Are you going to fight internal affairs, or are you going to give in?" Brian shrugged, his voice tired, almost lifeless. "I don't know, Danny. I thought the truth would give me peace, but now I have no wife, no career. Emma is gone, and I don't even know where she is. Martin is in a cell, but that doesn't change the fact that I've lost everything." Danny put his hand on his shoulder, his voice softening. "You didn't lose everything, Mac. You solved the collar case, even if it cost you dearly. And Emma, maybe it's for the best. She admitted to knowing about Martin's business, even if not everything. You couldn't live with that lie. Give yourself time. And stay away from the database until this all blows over." Brian nodded, but Danny's words couldn't fill the hole in his chest. He'd come home to an apartment that was now empty not only without Emma, but without the warmth that had once made it a home. Her things were gone, the closet was half empty, her favorite books were missing from the shelf, and none of her silly mugs with slogans remained in the kitchen. She'd left without leaving a note, just a quick text on his phone that had arrived while he'd been at Richard's. "Brian, I need time. I can't live with your suspicions and your revenge. I'm sorry, but this is the end." He sat down on the couch, looking at the message, and felt the last threads that connected him to Emma snapping. He wanted to call her, to scream at her that it was her fault, that her lies, her affair with Martin had ruined their marriage, but instead he just sat there, staring into space until the rain outside stopped, leaving only silence as oppressive as his thoughts. The days following the revelation were a blur. Internal Affairs launched an investigation, and Brian was officially suspended, ordered to submit to interrogations where he was asked every detail: how he had gained access to the wiretap, why he had used the database, whether he had known about the possible consequences. He answered honestly, knowing that there was no point in lying, and each answer was another nail in the coffin of his career. Colleagues, even those who had respected him for solving the collar case, now kept their distance, and only Danny occasionally called with news. Martin had hired top lawyers, arguing that the wiretap was illegal and the case against him was shaky. But the evidence Brian had collected still held, and Collar, feeling the pressure, had begun to rat on his partners, giving hope that the investigation would succeed even if Brian did not live to see the end. One evening, a week later, Brian was sitting in a bar near the station where he used to drink with colleagues after his shift. But now he was alone, with a whiskey in his hand, which he drank not for pleasure, but to numb the pain. The bartender, an old acquaintance named Tony, noticed his condition and said, pouring another drink, "Mac, you look like your world has fallen apart. I heard you took down some hotshot lawyer. Is it true it was because of his wife?" Brian looked at him, his eyes empty, but he answered, his voice hoarse as if the words were stuck in his throat. "It's true, Tony. I wanted to know if she was cheating, and I found more than I was looking for. Now she's gone, and I'm about to be out of a job. Was it worth it? I don't know." Tony shook his head, his face showing sympathy. "Love is shit, Mac. But you're a cop. You always find a way. Maybe it's time to start over. Without her, without this mess." Brian chuckled, but there was no joy in his laughter. "Start over? From what? I have no home, no family, and soon, maybe, not even a badge. All I have left is the truth, and even that isn't worth what I've lost." He finished his whiskey and went out into the rain, which had started again, as if the sky had decided to remind him of that evening in the Belle Epoque, walked the streets, not knowing where he was going, feeling every drop wash away the remnants of who he was. Emma was gone, his career was hanging by a thread, his reputation was tarnished, and all that was left was the bitter truth for which he had paid too high a price. But somewhere deep inside, he knew that he would not stop, not because he wanted revenge, but because the truth, no matter how much it hurt, was the only thing keeping him afloat in this sea of pain and loss. New York City, that unforgiving city that never sleeps but always watches its inhabitants wrestle with their own demons, was shrouded in a gray haze of autumn fog when Brian McKinley, a man whose life had once been built on the clear lines of duty, love, and truth, stood on the Hudson River, looking out at the murky waters that reflected his own turmoil, like a mirror showing not a face but a wounded soul, where every scar was the result of his choices, his obsessions, his relentless thirst for truth that had left him alone, surrounded by nothing but the ashes of what had once been his life. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with dampness, and every breath Brian took felt heavy, as if he were inhaling not oxygen, but the weight of his losses, Emma, his career, his belief in himself. The apartment he returned to every evening was no longer a home, but an empty shell, where the echo of his footsteps reminded him of how far he had come, crossing the line between duty and revenge, between love and obsession. It had been a week since Internal Affairs had handed down its verdict. Brian had been fired from the NYPD for violating protocol, for using police resources for personal gain, for the wiretap that, while it had helped bring down Alexander Martin and jump-started the Vincent Collar case, had been his professional downfall. His badge, the cold piece of metal he had worn with pride for 15 years, now sat in a drawer next to a photograph of him and Emma smiling against the Tuscan hills, a photograph that had once been a symbol of their happiness, now like a knife in the heart because Emma was gone, leaving nothing but a short message and an empty closet, and he was left alone with a question that tormented him more than any interrogation had. What was worse, losing the woman he loved or losing himself? The station where he had spent half his life was now closed to him. His colleagues, even those who had once respected his tenacity, now looked the other way, and rumors of his personal vendetta scattered across the city like autumn leaves in the wind. Danny Corso, his partner, the only one who hadn't looked away, had stopped by the day before, bringing beer and news. Martin was under investigation, but his lawyers were predictably fighting to have the wiretap inadmissible, and Collar, under pressure from new evidence, had begun to rat out his partners, which could lead to a big expose. Danny, chewing on his eternal toothpick, looked at Brian and said, his voice a mixture of sympathy and irritation, "Mac, you did what you thought was right, but damn, you paid too much. The Collar case is moving forward, but you're not there, and that's not fair. You were the best of us. What now? Are you going to sit around feeling sorry for yourself?" Brian, holding the bottle of beer he had never opened, answered, his voice quiet, almost lifeless. "Danny, I don't regret catching Martin, but I regret losing myself. I thought the truth would save me, give me control, but it just ruined everything. Emma's gone, my job's gone, and I don't even know if I'm a cop, a husband, or just an idiot who screwed everything up." Danny shook his head, his gaze heavy but filled with genuine concern. "You're not an idiot, Mac. You're a man who loved too much and believed in justice. Emma, she made her choice, and it's not your fault. And the job, well, you'll find something new. Maybe a private detective. You can't just sit there and stare at the walls. And you know, if you didn't go all the way, you wouldn't be you. That's you, the guy who doesn't give up, even when the odds are against him." Brian nodded, but Danny's words couldn't penetrate the fog of his thoughts. He was alone after his partner left, and he spent the night staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong, at which point his pursuit of the truth had turned into an obsession that had burned all his bridges. He thought of Emma, her laugh, her green eyes that shone when they were happy, and her tears when Chef Belle Epoque, when she screamed that he had ruined their lives. Maybe she was right. Maybe if he hadn't dug, hadn't followed, hadn't set that trap, they could have found a way to save their marriage. But then he remembered her words during the interrogation. "I knew Alex was involved with Collar, but I loved him." And he knew that their marriage had been doomed long before that night, because love built on lies cannot survive. Now, standing on the embankment, he looked out over the river, where the reflections of the city lights trembled like his own thoughts. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and opened the last message from Emma, reading it for the 100th time. "Brian, I need time. I can't live with your suspicions and your revenge. I'm sorry, but this is the end." He wanted to text her, to ask where she was, to tell her that he still loved her despite the pain, but instead he just stared at the screen until it went dark, as if mirroring his own fading. Emma was out there somewhere, in this vast city, perhaps with Martin, perhaps alone, but she was lost to him, and he knew he couldn't bring her back because the truth he had uncovered had made them strangers. But losing Emma, as heartbreaking as it was, wasn't the worst thing. What was worse was losing himself, the man who believed in justice, in the law, in the truth always winning. He was a shadow of the Brian who'd worn the badge with pride 15 years earlier, who'd promised Emma he'd love her forever, who'd thought he could control his life. He'd become the man who'd broken his oath, who'd used the law as a weapon, who'd turned love into an investigation, and now, standing on the edge of the embankment, he wondered, who was he now? An empty shell, living for a truth that had produced nothing but ashes. He remembered that evening in Belle Epoque, when it all came out, when Emma and Martin's voices in his headphones tore his world apart. He remembered Emma looking at him, her eyes full of tears and anger. "You're not a husband, you're a monster." Those words burned him more than any accusation from the Internal Affairs Department because there was truth in them. He had become a monster not because he wanted revenge, but because he couldn't stop, couldn't let go, couldn't live with a lie. And now that the lie had been revealed, he was alone, with the ashes of his life blown into the river by the wind. Brian turned and walked away from the boardwalk, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying all his mistakes on his shoulders. He didn't know where he was going home, to the bar, or just nowhere, but he knew he had to find an answer to the question that was plaguing him. What was worse? Losing Emma, the woman he loved more than life itself, or losing himself, the man he was? There was no answer, but somewhere deep inside he knew that by losing himself he had lost the right to her love, because a man who destroys everything for the sake of truth cannot hope for happiness. The city around him lived its own life. Cars honked, passers-by hurried to take shelter from the beginning rain, and the lights of skyscrapers shone like stars that he could no longer reach. Brian walked, and each step was a step into the unknown, where there was no Emma, no badge, no former self. Only ashes that settled on his shoulders and a grim but realistic ending to his story, leaving room for reflection. Is it possible to build a new life on the ruins of the old? And is the truth worth such a price? Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.